show me any place in America where a school would close if we got rid of the 4 or 5 billion or whatever it is today spent annually on the Federal Department of Education that educates not even one child. Next thing we'd get rid of is Child Protective Services funding from the federal authorities. All that, just chop it off. Either the states and the counties think it's good to kidnap children, then pay for it out of your pocket now, and then demand accountability. Because if the people locally in our county had to pay for all the kidnapping done by Child Protective Services, you bet they would demand some transparency, because there's none. Child gets kidnapped, put into foster, and it's just like they go into the gulag. They can rape those children, kill those children, and they have. They have been raped and killed in foster care. Susan Schell out in Colorado did a great job for years and years until they simply banned her, said we can't let her in the courtroom anymore. She's humiliating us with the truth. Thank you, Susan Schell of Colorado. Did a great job for many, many years. An unsung hero of children kidnapped from the rightful good parents to fund the follies, the sex slaverings of these creeps that Trump still hasn't got indicted. So that's what I would do if I was president. And yet we're obsessing over a tiny, tiny little piece of money over building a wall. And, you know, walls work to a degree, but it didn't work for the Chinese thousands of years ago. They built this Great Wall of China. Astronauts have said they can actually see the Great Wall of China from orbit. The problem is, when the Mongol hordes came, they penetrated the Great Wall by trickery. I think it had to do with sex and a woman. Gee, what's new under the sun? Okay, with that, I want to show you a picture of Captain Nick. Let's bring up picture 1. I'm done with my State of the Union address. There's Captain Nicholas J. Wagener, my father. Now let's go to picture 2. The reason I'm talking about him is in this article. This is a Sunday Picture Journal, Milwaukee Journal of October 27th, 1963. Just about a month before Kennedy was assassinated. And here you see the Mackinac Straits, and I believe, if my memory serves me, that's the barge Hilda being towed by the tugboat John Purvis, and my father was the captain of that red and black ship you saw there, the John Purvis. Now, opening up this article, you see a story starts here. It says, Skipper Nick and the Impossible Cargo. Got that? Skipper Nick and the tugboat captain Nicholas Wagener knew he was pulling an unusual cargo. Through the pilot house window, Nick could watch a taut tow line extended from the winch on the tug's fantail to a barge riding high in Lake Michigan. For 35 years, Skipper Nick had lugged such things as pulpwood rafts, barges loaded with stone, coal, steel ingots on the Great Lakes. Now he was playing nursemaid in a 224-ton rotary kiln that loomed large on the deck of the barge behind him. On the surface, the cargo was anything but exciting to Nick, who had weathered wartime emergency schedules, grounded freighters, and some of the Great Lakes' worst northeasters. But Nick knew, and did his 13 crew members, that this cargo was probably the most important chunk of steel he had ever pulled. Fabricated by the Alice Chambers Manufacturing Company, the huge kiln was the guts of a low-grade iron ore pelletizing plant to be erected by the Empire Iron Mining Company at Palmer, Michigan, just outside of Marquette. That plant would cost about $9 million and mean jobs. Now we're talking about $9 million in 1963. and mean jobs for hundreds of men suffering from upper peninsula-going tug, the John Purvis picked up 2 giant steel rings cast in Erie's, Pennsylvania's foundry. The 197,000-pound rings provided the stability for the rotating kilns. If you go to another shot, you'll get a view in the next shot, Stephen, the next picture. Go to the next picture. You'll see how big these steel things were, and you understand why they couldn't just pull them on an 18-wheeler. They're way too big for an 18-wheeler. There's the barge that carried them, but the barge doesn't have an engine of its own. You see that tow line going off the fantail there? In the bottom picture, right by where it says Take Back America? That's the barge. Then in the next picture, I think you see the how big these things are. Turn the page. Go to the other picture. Next picture. Just keep going through them, Stephen. At Milwaukee, the kiln, separated into 6 sections, was loaded onto the barge and welded to its deck to prevent rolling in the lakes. They literally welded those things, and you can see it going through a locks there. I think that's, yeah. Yeah, just go through the pictures so we get through them all. Nick set a course of 32 degrees north by northeast to the Point Betsy Light north of Frankfort, Michigan. After that, he followed a devious course between the islands and reefs in the northern reaches of the lake. The Purvis passed under the new Mackinac Strait Bridge into Lake Huron and then to St. Mary's River on the upbound route to the Sioux Locks. Once the tug locked through to Lake Superior, it was clear sailing to the Marquette Harbor, where flat cars were to be waiting to transport the kiln to the upper Palmer, onto Palmer, Michigan. Why the water route to Palmer? That's what Ed Weller, assistant traffic manager of AC, Alice Chambers, had asked himself a dozen times. And each time the answer was, that's the only way we can do it. That's Captain Nick. That's the way he usually looked, holding the capstan there. I think he just put it in reverse. That was a very common sight to see my dad like that. He didn't wear a fancy captain's uniform with a captain's hat and white suit jacket and all that. That would he would have been embarrassed by that. But I think he did get one of those when he worked later on in his last work for Inland Steel. But that's the way I normally saw him, in that black and white thick wool shirt. Moving the kiln in sections by truck was impossible. Each piece weighed between 58,000 and 99,000 pounds. That's a lot of tons, people. Even if Michigan's frost law allowed such loads on the spring thaw, why not rail? The kiln measured 18 feet and 6 inches in diameter at its widest point. Transporting it by flat car to Marquette was not practical. Such things as narrow bridges and tunnels, rail switches, buildings, and yardmasters' shanties stood in the way. So the only way to get these huge chunks of cylinders was by ship. And the only tugboat captain on the Great Lakes they trusted to do that was my father, Captain Nick Wagener. And I actually sailed with him that summer. Though I wasn't on that particular job, I had to go to school. And I was back. I'd sailed with him and held that same capstan, held the wheel on that boat. There's a shot here, the last shot, I think, or second to last shot, where you can see these sections sitting on the barge. You got that, Stephen? You can see these huge sections. They cover the deck, and they literally welded them to the deck. I remember, there you go, there's the shot. And you can see a tugboat pushing it. That's the John Purvis, right near the back. It's called the stern of the ship, I think. No, it's at by the bow, but it's pushing it backward into a port. Yeah, that was a major job, and Captain Nick Wagener was the man they called to do it. Many a night we would have these northeasters, and I'd be home in my bed in early November, and there'd be a blizzard blowing, and I would be frightened to my bones. 14, 15, I'd go to wrestling package, come home, turn on the weather, and here there's a terrible storm. And there was one that finished off the Fitzgerald. It was a huge cargo ship called the Fitzgerald, and there's even a song about the sinking of the Fitzgerald, which sank in the northern part of Lake Superior. Anyway, that night I was really terrified that my dad might be somewhere out there in this terrible storm. Luckily, the tugboat was only 150 feet long, and it tended to bounce like a cork on these huge waves. But really long barges that were like 500, 700 feet long. The one I remember most was the Hilda, but there was also another barge called I think it was called a Solvi, or Sovi. I think it was named after Captain John Roan's wife or daughter, I forget. But I sailed with my dad many summers, as did my older brother, Dr. Nick Wagener, before he became a doctor, and my deaf brother, Jimmy, and my brother-in-law, Orrin DeFair. We all sailed with Captain Nick because it paid really well and kept you out on the water all the time you're working, so you didn't get a chance to spend your money. That's the F.J. Fitzgerald? Is that it? Yeah. When this ship broke in half, and it was just only a few years ago, there's the Fitzgerald, and I remember that August of that year, 63, passing that Fitzgerald, never knowing that that ship would be at the bottom of Lake Superior, by December or January, whenever it was. And there's a whole song written about that. It was terrifying. All hands lost, captain, deckhands, everybody in the Fitzgerald, they all drowned. They think what happened is the waves were so huge that the ship nose would go up and then it would go down the other side, and it cracked in half. And when it came up again and cracked the second time, the nose just went under, it broke in half. It actually hit the bottom. The waves were like 30, 40 feet, cracked the boat. Once the boat's in the middle cracked, down it went. And I think it was carrying iron ore, so it had a heavy load, but I don't remember all the details. But they brought some items up for it some years ago, because this is really cold water. You have to go in an insulated dry suit to get down there. You can't stand to be down there and under that water for very long in a wetsuit. But it's things like that that had me terrified as a 14, 13-year-old, because to me my dad was the greatest parent of the team that hatched me and my brothers and sisters. And he died in 1988. Captain Nick Wagener passed away about this time of year, 1988, at the age of 75. And he had only been retired from, I think his last company he worked for was Inland Steel. He didn't want to be a captain. He wanted less pressure. I think he took a position as third mate, and he was happy. He didn't have all the responsibility, just do his shift and get off. And I think they did give him a white uniform, but he was I'm a working captain. I work for my living. And he would get down and work with the deckhands if it needed to be, but normally he was up there like you saw him in that black and white picture, turning the big wheel and putting it reverse back. Captain Nicholas Wagener. He was a gentleman, and he would have been a scholar. His father was a medical doctor, and had the Great Depression not hit and the bankers not robbed us in 1929 through 1935, if the bank gangsters had not robbed us, my dad would have been a doctor or an architect or a lawyer. Funny little thing, his grandmother, my father's grandmother, took all her money out of the bank the week before the banks collapsed. And there was this big run on the banks in this little town of Sturgeon Bay. She got all her money out. It was about $3,500, which in those days was a lot of money. Back in 1929, that was a lot of money. And this was all the money Grandma had saved. She was the widow of Sheriff William Wagener, I believe. It's all the money she had saved from working, cleaning houses, and from her husband's pension and what he had saved. She gave it to my dad, Captain Nick. Said, "Here, Nick, go to college." My dad was young. He was like 19. "Oh, Grandma, I can't take your life savings." It would have been enough to go through college. And my dad, full of young pride, said, "Grandma, take your money back. Put it in the bank. You need it to live on." Well, she put it back in the bank a few days later, and 2 or 3 days after that, the banks collapsed. Her money disappeared. The banks were not insured, at least not that local bank in Sturgeon Bay in Door County, Wisconsin, and he lost everything. She lost it all. And Captain Nick never got to go to college. He took a few correspondence courses. Later, when he was a ship captain, he had time. He aced all his correspondence courses. He did pretty well for a man that had a lot of bad luck, a lot of mistakes in his youth. Pulled it out, raised 5 kids that I was among, stayed married to my mother, who was less than perfect mother, but she was a hot number when he married her. Captain Nick. So, that brings me to what I really wanted to talk to before we go to my interview with Irwin Schiff. God rest his soul. He's been dead now about 3 years. I want to go back to Lyndon Baines Johnson. This guy you see on the cover of this book by Philip Nelson, those brooding eyes of LBJ is what we called him. LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, one of the worst, most murderous psychopaths America has ever had to endure. Even in college, even in high school, he tricked his father into buying him this Florida white suit, way above his status. The Johnsons were poor people, really poor people. So I'm turning to page 23. I'm just going to give you some highlights. Second paragraph. Joe M. Kilgore, a Texan who worked for Lyndon Johnson for 20 years, finally realized that Johnson would believe only that which he wanted to, that Johnson often mistook his delusions for truth. Who else do we know was like that? Some instances, such as his grandfather's supposed death at the Alamo, were relatively harmless. Others, like his belief that he and he alone knew how to beat back the communists in Vietnam, were highly destructive. I lost 5 cousins in that mistake of LBJ. According to Kilgore, Johnson went from feigning surprise at receiving the Silver Star to uttering doubts about whether it was deserved, to complaining that it was only the Silver Star. He came to believe that he had been shortchanged and should have been granted a superior medal, the Medal of Honor. He believed it totally. Johnson's propensity to become convinced that a lie was the truth, no matter what, would manifest over and over and over throughout his career. The Johnson recruits, bottom paragraph, page 23 of this book. Johnson recruited 3 of his men during the tumultuous year of 1948, concurring with the infamous campaign that culminated in his successful theft of the election to the Senate. Johnson, yeah, you heard me right, I said that right. With his infamous campaign that culminated in his successful theft of the election to the U.S. Senate. All right, sorry, it says to the Senate, not U.S. Senate. Johnson met Cliff Carter in 1937 and got to know him further in 1946, when Carter became involved in Olin Teague's congressional campaign. Apparently, Carter had impressed Johnson because 2 years later, as Johnson prepared for his Senate campaign, he called Carter to ask him to be the campaign manager for the 6th District. Thus, their association began in May of 1948. Carter furnished an oral interview explaining how he was appointed to a position of the U.S. Marshal he had not only did not solicit, but did not even want. That's interesting. It says, see the transcript of, in the footnotes of Clifton C. Carter Oral History Interview by Dorothy L. Pierce. Turning the page, page 24. Then he won the Democratic nomination and went to win the election as United States Senator in November of 1948. What else was happening in 1948? And this picture you're seeing right here, this is Lyndon Baines Johnson and Lady Bird, I think they're standing next to him in the blue suit, and he's picking up his dog by the ears. Now, this picture became very famous back in the 60s. And LBJ got so much criticism about this picture, he ordered the secretary not to give him any more messages about it. But the people who love pets, outraged, because that hurts a dog to pick them up by the ears, just like it hurts your 5-year-old if you grab them by the 2 ears and pick them up, which I had a mean uncle did that to me once, and it's not fun to be picked up by your ears. He was a murderer till the day he died, Lyndon Baines Johnson, and picking a dog up by the ears was the least of his crimes. The very, very least of his crimes. He had his own sister murdered, and that's in this book. You should get this book and read it yourself, and you say, well, what difference does it make, William? That was 50 years ago. Well, the difference it makes, when you start to understand that President John Fitzgerald Kennedy can be assassinated with the aid and help of a guy who's there to supposedly protect them, was George Herbert Walker Bush, in charge of the naval security, he said, and he told all these secrets, go down to the strip club there and go have some drinks. I got it covered. He didn't have anything covered. What he was doing, there's Jack Kennedy with Vice President Lyndon Baines Johnson right behind him. And you just look at the evil in LBJ's eye. He's jealous. He's foaming inside himself. He's thinking, I should be making this presidential speech, not Jack Kennedy. I've killed my sister. I killed an agricultural agent, killed 8 or 9 or more people to get to this position to be president, and then the Kennedys come in and steal it for me. LBJ, look at those brooding eyes. He hated the Kennedys. He hated Jack Kennedy. He hated Bobby Kennedy, the Attorney General. Anyway, reading on. Then he won the Democratic convention, and on June 8th, 1949, he called me one morning at 8 o'clock in the morning and said he wanted to submit my name for nomination as United States Marshal for the Southern District of Texas. I don't think up to that minute I had thought more than 60 seconds in my entire life about a United States Marshal. What a Marshal did. And I thanked him and told him that I was grateful for his consideration, but I really couldn't undertake the job. Mr. Johnson said, hell, I'm not going to take an answer of no on that. I'll call you back this same time in the morning. So I'll call you back in the morning, and I don't want to hear that word no. Click. Well, when the president talks to you like that and says, I don't want to hear the word no, knowing the power the president has to do all kinds of illegal things that the average person won't understand what's going on. And they just like when they killed Kennedy, all the people that saw where the real shots were coming were rounded up, taken to a room, and told, you will shut your mouth, you will never speak of this, or there'll be trouble for you and your family. And those guys that were threatening him were most likely showing him FBI badges, but they really were working for the CIA. This was an inside CIA murder of our own president. So when you understand that this happened, why would it be that the FBI, the CIA, and all the corporate media are bashing Trump and bashing Trump and bashing Trump, just like they bashed that good Republican, the senator from Arizona, Barry Goldwater? Yeah, you thought I was going to say this other guy that just died, who I have very little respect for. Yeah, he served time in North Korea as a prisoner, but that's a whole story in itself. I'm talking about Goldwater, Barry Goldwater. I actually communicated with Barry Goldwater once on a ham radio. I was a ham radio operator, and so was Barry Goldwater. One day, I saw him come on, give his sign-on call, and say, "Hey, Barry." He was a U.S. senator, and he took time to talk to a kid up in Sturgeon Bay, Wisconsin. I was really impressed. I guess that's how, important people that have important jobs to do, they find a way to, relax by doing things like that. Michael Jackson was known to call up security guards he had only met briefly going in and out of a building, and gave them a phone number to call, and then they'd call him or he'd call them. And you're like, what's the connection? He likes to talk to real normal people. People are not. There's Barry Goldwater. He's saying, "Shh, William, don't talk so much about me. I'm at rest. I want to stay at rest." All right, Barry, we'll let you rest. But you were a heck of a good U.S. senator from the state of Arizona. I just wish you had been able to put Lyndon Baines Johnson in prison before he got the chance to conspire with George Herbert Walker Bush, not George W., George Herbert Walker Bush, and J. Edgar Hoover, that cross-dressing, fat, chubby guy who's got his name on the FBI building. They should just scrape that name off the building. He blackmailed all those congressmen. I'm talking about Hoover. He had all the dirt, photographs, all that kind of stuff of illegal activity on just about every congressman that ever went to Congress. That's why he stayed in as the FBI director, and JFK was going to get rid of him right after he got rid of Lyndon Baines Johnson and put somebody else from the South as his running mate for his re-election in '64. The game hasn't changed. When you understand, see, this book only came out a few years ago, just a few years ago. If this book had come out while Lyndon Baines Johnson was alive, the author would have been assassinated mysteriously, and the publisher would have immediately pulled his book off the shelf. It wouldn't have been available. That's how things were back in the 60s and 70s, and they're still that way. That's my point. Reading on. Carter found someone else to manage his bottling plant as he took the appointment and went on the government payroll, all the while working as a volunteer for Johnson, who put his key men on other payrolls to minimize his own. Carter said that Jake Pickle, who was running the overall campaign, told him, quote, "Now what I ought to do is get you on some company's payroll where you'll be doing this traveling for them and actually attending to this work." Carter refused to allow the campaign to cover his expenses, telling Pickle, quote, "I am doing this because I believe in Mr. Johnson, that I was an amateur, and that I wanted to retain my amateur status. I didn't want to be paid for any of it," unquote. Carter said that Johnson seemed to him to be planning his presidential candidacy since he first met him in 1937, people. LBJ was planning his own presidency before he was even elected to the Senate, and specifically, quote, talked to him about that in the 1948 campaign when he was running for the Senate. Johnson had clearly identified useful aspects of Carter's character by then, and undoubtedly his 100% devotion and willingness to perform any task assigned to him were paramount, and had already decided that he would fit well in his organization. In 1954, Johnson made him campaign manager for 5 districts and would rely on him for certain expected future tasks that would require delicate but forceful assertions. Horace Busby and Malcolm Wallace joined the Johnson campaign about the same time as Carter. In fact, it was Carter who brought Wallace to Washington, D.C., introducing him to Johnson at Johnson's home on 30th Place. Johnson had placed Wallace in the agricultural department, and by 1951, Wallace had passed an FBI background check and obtained work as an economist. But as with all other men installed in government positions by his mentor, Wallace was serving primarily as Johnson's man. Mac Wallace and Horace Busby were not only classmates but fellow radical leftist socialists and campus activists. Both were members of the exclusive Friars Society. They were involved in the same issues during the late 1940s, including the widely reported protests against the firing of President of the University of Texas, Homer Rainey, a socialist, who had been heavily attacked by conservative Texans. When President Rainey was dismissed by the Board of Regents because of his liberal persuasions, Busby used the Daily Texan to organize a campus rally for Rainey. At this rally, the student body president, Malcolm Wallace, led a march to the state capitol and then a small group of students to the governor's office, forcing the governor to temporarily leave town. During this period, Busby and Wallace shared the same liberal political beliefs, and both were members of some of the liberal campus clubs and organizations. They also had common appearance with both names in numerous Texas newspapers being read in Washington by Congressman, soon-to-be Senator Lyndon B. Johnson, who used such news items to recruit men to come to Washington. Busby, as student editor of the Texan, received 2 letters from Johnson complimenting him on his editorials. Gee, what a surprise. There's a lot of... So that's how he starts. Going farther into this book, I have highlighted some things. I feel I would be remiss if I did not read some of these things that depict the character of the scumbag, murderous President Lyndon Baines Johnson. Those are my opinion and my words. That's not in this book. Those are my words, my opinion. Okay, page 47. Johnson as a freshman senator. Soon, bottom of the page, soon after Johnson returned to Washington as the newly elected Texas senator, he demonstrated both his willingness to give big political paybacks to his financial benefactors and propensity for savagely attacking political opponents. In his 1949 campaign to oust Leland Olds, a veteran chairman of the Federal Power Commission, Olds' record as chairman was impeccable, and his work was completely in accordance with the congressional standards established for the commission. But because of his effectiveness as a commissioner, he was not liked by certain influential men in Texas who felt he was a threat to their ongoing acquisition of untold fortunes. For this reason, he was to lose his position, meager wealth, home, financial security. He eventually died a virtual pauper, all thanks to Lyndon Baines Johnson. For doing a good job, he died as a pauper. My brother, Dr. Nick Wagener, used to say, no good turn goes unpunished in this country, in this world, in this life. Dr. Nick, you had it right. Looking down to the middle of page 49, reading on, once the hearings and subcommittee debate commenced, Olds was unmercifully attacked for his writings 20-some years earlier, in which he had advanced the idea of public interests were superior to the corporate interests of the power companies. I would say that would be a very popular idea even today. The public interests were superior to the corporate interests of the power company. even today. And you know what? Considering the leftist socialists that LBJ was grooming to be in his organization, that should fit. But because he was obstructing Johnson, there he is again pulling the dog's ears, obstructing Johnson's ultimate goals, he had to go. And Olds died a virtual pauper. Now I'm turning further in this book by Philip F. Nelson, the author, turning way back to page 121 near the last paragraph, 6th line from the bottom, starts, Kennedy himself mused about the irony that he and Khrushchev were essentially in the same position within their respective governments. Both were trying to prevent nuclear war, but they were both under severe, quote, severe pressure from the hardline crowd, which interprets every move in the direction as appeasement. Oh, really? Did you understand? Khrushchev, if you don't know who that was, he was the dictator of communist Russia, or what we call the USSR. Khrushchev was head, and Kennedy, back in the early 60s, was president. And he's saying that both were trying to prevent nuclear war, but they were both under, quote, severe pressure from the hardline crowd, which interprets every move in that direction as appeasement. And in the notes I wrote here, hand notes in the margin, this is the bankster control. They control all this adversary stuff. It's designed to create wars. The military-industrial. Dwight D. Eisenhower, leaving office, his last speech, he warned us about the military-industrial complex having way too much influence. And those are the same guys that manipulated LBJ, helped him get to where he wanted to be. They knew he was willing to participate. And what they needed from LBJ was simply to assume the presidency and make sure if anybody got caught, he would cover it up and it would all go away. And that's why when I read the notes of that journalist, Dorothy Kilgallen, who used to be on a show, I think it was called What's My Line? And then suddenly one day she was not anymore. She had died rather strangely after getting a new boyfriend, probably sent by special care, courtesy of the CIA, probably. I can't prove that one yet, but you know, if someone were to really dig into the death of Dorothy Kilgallen, I think you would find there's a direct link to Lee Harvey Oswald being found to have not fired any gun at all on November 22nd, 1963. He didn't fire any gun at all. We know that because the murder investigator at Texas told Dorothy Kilgallen, I just gave him the paraffin test. He hasn't fired any weapon. He couldn't have killed, then he couldn't have killed Officer Tibbets, who was said to look a lot like Kennedy, and he couldn't have shot Kennedy. And to think he could have shot Tibbets and killed Kennedy and nobody noticed him running around with a gun? There are too many people out in Dallas watching President Kennedy that day. If you don't know this, I guess most of you under age 50 couldn't possibly have known it. You weren't born yet. But Officer Tibbets was jokingly said to look a lot like President Kennedy. Why would anybody go shoot some cop who looks like our president? Well, read the book. Once they get Tibbets' body, the problem is Kennedy was shot from the front. They had to make it look like it was shot from the back. That was the plan. So they had a backup body that looked a little bit like Kennedy, and even President Kennedy's wife, Jacqueline, when they showed her the casket later, when they got to Washington, D.C., she said, that's not Jack. She would know her husband. They'd switched the bodies. And I know this sounds very far-fetched, but I'm telling you, there's at least 6 books like this one that say exactly what I've just told you. And they don't want you to read these books. They don't want you to discover the truth. Turning on to page 146, of Philip F. Nelson's book. This would prove to be a good investment. I'm going to start at above. Bobby's aggressive efforts to get rid of Marcello must have been an embarrassment to Lyndon Johnson, who had long worked in behalf of the interests of many mafioso, Carlos Marcello in particular. His ties to Marcello went back to the early 50s, when one of Marcello's lieutenants, Jack Heflin, agreed to set aside a percentage of profits to help LBJ fund his senatorial campaign. Right here. I'm not saying this. Philip F. Nelson is quoting somebody else. He's quoting Mahoney from Mahoney's book. Page 184 of Mahoney's book. He's quoting Mahoney's books. Jack Heflin agreed to set aside a percentage of profits to help LBJ fund his senatorial campaign. This would prove to be a good investment. In exchange for such contribution, Johnson consistently impeded anti-racketeering legislation throughout his government service. And once he became president, the Justice Department organized crime operation was suspended. Goodbye, Robert Kennedy. We ain't going to do this anymore because Johnson is now president, not your dead brother. Reading what's written here, Johnson ordered all FBI bugging of the mafia to cease. FBI Special Agent William F. Romer Jr., who had been spearheading the attack on the mob in Chicago, concluded, quote, "If you judge a man by his acts, here was a man, LBJ, who did more." But it's found here in the footnotes of Philip F. Nelson's book, LBJ, the Mastermind of the Assassination. I just had to read you that. LBJ, I'm telling you, he was a murderous scumbag. He protected the mafioso. They were grateful. Skipping ahead to page 222, I know I want to get to Irwin Schiff, but I want to read you a few more quotes here. But you really ought to get this book and read it, because the same crap is still going on by the same crooked FBI today. The FBI, you cannot trust it, as you cannot trust the CIA. You're better off trusting your sheriff, even if you don't like him. At least you can elect him. You don't elect any FBI agents. You don't elect any CIA agents. And most of them have offshore accounts and black budget money that the Congress doesn't authorize. Anyway, page 222. Top of the page. Wallace still managed to secure top security clearances thanks again to Lyndon Johnson, despite his conviction for first-degree murder. Murder with malice aforethought. Hello, that's what it says. It's right here. I'm not making this up. So does Mac Wallace committed first-degree murder. He got probation. I have to go back here to read you something else. Going back to page 220. The article was short on substantive information about the Christmas party and who the other guests might have been. Although the rumor suggested that Malcolm Wallace was one of the other guests. Shortly after leaving the party and returning to her home, Josefa died mysteriously in the early morning hours of December 25th, 1961, in a final deference to the wishes of her brother, the Vice President of the United States. It was decided that, in direct contradiction of the laws of the state of Texas, no autopsy or inquest other than the other investigation was necessary. Let me say that again. In direct contradiction of Texas state law, it was decided no autopsy or inquest or other investigation was necessary. The Vice President's sister just died mysteriously on Christmas Eve, or on Christmas Day, December 25th, 1961. And they're going to break Texas law. That's the influence. This crooked scumbag, Lyndon Baines Johnson, a hardcore Democrat after there was. Whichever way the wind's blowing, that'll get him into the president. That's the way he's going. Now, why did he kill his sister? I could read you more about that. It goes back to, she had a big mouth when she got drunk, and she would say, hey, my brother can get you killed. My brother can get that person killed. You know, he's going to be president someday. And she would say it in the most inappropriate parties and circumstances. Then there was the Billy Saw Estes in those days, and there was that whole scandal. His list of 8 people who personally knew died on the orders of Lyndon Baines Johnson. By the time Estes made the startling assertions, he had served his time and had little to gain by divulging this information. Now, Billy Saw Estes was a crook, and he was benefiting from doing dirty work for Lyndon Baines Johnson. He eventually, however, did get caught in many felonies, was sent to prison, and what they're saying here, I'll read it again. Billy Saw Estes, in 1984, included her name on a list of people, talking about Kyle Brown, a list of 8 people who he personally knew that Lyndon Baines Johnson had ordered killed. I'm reading from the middle, page 221. That's why Johnson liked his own people as U.S. Marshals and that sort of thing. Get them in there, even if they had already been convicted of first-degree premeditated murder. How do you get a security clearance? Top secret security clearance when you've been convicted of first, because it was what the vice president wanted at the time, or Senator Lyndon Baines Johnson at the time. That's how that happens. There is so much in here. I can't read you the whole book. You'd fall asleep. But I can only emphatically beg you. One more picture. Steve, we need to zoom in on this. We didn't get this. Take a look at this picture, people, right here. Look really closely. You see the swearing in on the plane, Air Force One, and you see Mrs. Kennedy, who would not leave the body of her husband. From the hospital to the airplane, she stayed right next to his casket. Then they switched the caskets during the swearing-in system, and 3 times they sent people back. 3 times. And the first 2 times she said, I'm not leaving Jack. I'm not leaving Jack. I'm staying right here by his body. And they said, the vice president really insists you come up. Here I am. Zoom out, somebody. There we go. We have glitches. When you do a show live, you have glitches. Anyway, Jacqueline Kennedy said, I'm not leaving my philandering husband's body. She loved him even though she knew he had had a lot of affairs. But then they got her up there. And if you look at that one picture, it looks like the guy in the bottom picture is winking as LBJ looks at him. We pulled this off. What LBJ was looking at him for is to see if they had switched their caskets. So when the casket arrived in Washington, D.C. on Air Force One, it wasn't JFK. Now, this is something we could still find out, could be still discovered. If the casket carrying what we thought was JFK's body turns out it was Officer Tibbetts, we need to exhume what they think is Jack Kennedy's body in Washington, D.C. and exhume Officer Tibbetts' body in Texas. The DNA will tell us exactly who those bones belong to. So we could still find out. There's a composite. Take a look. That Officer Tibbetts looked an awful lot like Jack Kennedy. That's why he was singled out among the Dallas police officers to be murdered that day, so they could switch him if the headshot didn't look right. And still, there is it's a really gruesome story. I'm not going to go into it. It's really too gruesome. How the guy had to switch the bodies and do work on the bodies to try to make Kennedy's head, or the head that they used as Kennedy's, look like it was Kennedy. And they were doing this patch job as they were flying the bodies back to D.C. But I think if you exhume both bodies and test the DNA, we'll come up with a really surprising And again, it matters because if they're that crooked back in the 60s and 70s, do you think they're any less crooked today when they're trying so hard to push 5G cell phone type communications on us, which is harmful to living things? So with that, I want to now thank you for watching. I'm going to give you Irwin Schiff, who's been dead several years now. I don't think I've ever aired this interview with him in his office when he had an office way back in 2002 or 2004 or something, before he was sent to prison by a crooked judge in Nevada, where he died blind, deaf, and handcuffed to a hospital bed. I don't know why Obama, who's supposed to be so merciful, couldn't have just said, we're going to release Irwin Schiff so he can die with his son and his family. He's blind, he's deaf, he's no threat to anybody, never was a threat to anybody except the IRS, because he wrote this marvelous book called The Federal Mafia, which is all about why you don't need to file federal personal income taxes. Don't need to pay them. There's no penalty. Now, they will harass you as if there is a penalty, but according to the IRS's own code book, which Irwin Schiff showed me himself, there isn't. So the IRS is acting illegally, unlawfully, and President Trump, once again, anybody that meets President Trump, asked him to abolish the IRS, the Federal Reserve, and wipe out the national debt, and our country will thrive again. It will make America great again, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. The churches can take over the social welfare programs and you know, only emergency cases, but we got a lot of people collecting SSI that could work. They just take the easy route out because there are so many federal bureaucrats need to sustain their job and find new SSI clients. That's my opinion, for what it's worth. Here's the interview with Irwin Schiff. Hope you pay attention. There's Irwin.
Oh, God. I keep forgetting to cover these things up. Oh, I mean, I don't know, but the complaint, the complaint. See, I still don't know. You mean did you get a collection due process hearing? See, there's too much involved here. We gotta have now. If you want to have a complaint, you didn't know what a complaint looks like. I can fax you a copy of a complaint, but this is just what a complaint looks like. You'd have to completely tailor it. But right now, I have to get some papers in, and there's a guy here who wants to do a short interview. I just don't know what I can. If you want a copy, if you want a sample lawsuit, I can. It's really a big job. You got to know something. You got to know something about discovery. I mean, filing the suit itself is no big deal. I can send it to you, but you got to know something about civil discovery. You should be reading a book. Look. And I have my criminal trial. I just can't get. If you want a copy of a sample lawsuit, I'll send it to you. But you got to know more than that. I mean, that's just a sample. What? Well, I know, but right now I can't. I got to get some legal documents in, and I just can't afford the time to. Let me see. Okay. Come here.
We're at Irwin Schiff's Las Vegas office when he had one. And it was quite an office indeed. And I'm the guy he's talking about wanting to do the interview. This guy never should have gone to prison, just like Ed Brown never should have gone to prison. The only people that should be in prison for years are people that do violent crime intentionally, like Mac Wallace, who got probation for first-degree premeditated murder, convicted by a jury. But the judge got the sentence. The judge was in LBJ's pocket, and LBJ needed a murderer. This guy, Irwin Schiff, never should have gone to prison. Why is that merciful Obama creature didn't let him have a merciful pardon from prison and die with his family? He would have died anyway.
Well, here in Las Vegas,
to die alone in a prison? Come on. Is that the America? Is that the America Nancy and Schumer and Hillary love? Yeah, that's the America they love, because they're in the pockets of the bank gangsters. Anyway, back to the interview with Irwin Schiff.
With Irwin Schiff, leading tax guru. Again, today is August 29th.
Is it the 30th?
I think. 30th.
It's what?
29.
29th.
29th.
2005. I'm William Wagener from On Second Thought Television. Irwin, last time I talked to you, you were just in the process of winning your appeal, I believe, on the civil case. Was that correct?
Well, I should have won it. As a matter of fact, what happened in the civil case, this is what the government does all the time. The public doesn't know this. The government sued me for $2.5 million, including $1 million in civil fraud penalties, with interest and penalties. Now, we should have a jury trial, because the civil fraud penalties were imposed pursuant to a statute that even didn't provide for the civil fraud penalties. There, for instance, to give you an example, in the government's complaint, the government stated that I didn't pay this amount of money after they sent me a notice and demand for payment. The government never sends out a notice and demand for payment, for the very reason that the laws which I sell, the laws are correct. And since there is no law that makes you liable for income tax or require you to pay it, there couldn't be a law authorizing the IRS to demand payment of a tax that doesn't exist. Now, during the course of discovery, I asked the government to produce any document that showed that they sent me a notice and demand for payment. I asked them to identify the document that they claimed was a notice and demand. I had government documents of what they had sent out, my transcripts. It showed no notice and demand was ever sent out. So in its response to my motion opposing the government's motion for summary judgment, the government claimed that my claim was that I never received the notice and demand for payment. Yet over and over again, in all my underlying documents, I said, no, they never sent it out. Now, before the government, before anybody in a civil litigation can get a summary judgment, the judge has to resolve all contested issues of fact most favorable to the person opposing the summary judgment. So just one fact alone, in which I said I never got a notice and demand. The government couldn't produce anything. There was nothing in the record that showed a notice and demand was ever sent out. The government was precluded from getting a summary judgment. This is only with respect to one issue. Now, if you want to see how criminal the U.S. government is, oh, incidentally, the $1 million, the $2.6 million that they were trying to extract from me was far greater in multiples than all the money I had earned during that same period of time. Now, to appreciate the true despicable character of your federal government, I want you to say, was there any depraved medieval tyrant who attempted to extract from a defeated enemy more in goods than that enemy possessed? The reason why the government can go after people and try to extract, not only from me, but from many other people, more money than they possess is because of the nonsensical levels of taxation we have with respect to the income tax. For example, when the income tax was first imposed in 1913, the tax was 1% on amounts of from $4,000 to $20,000. And that started at $4,000. Where the average income of the average American was under $500. So you have to understand that only about 1/2 or 1% of the people living in 1913 paid the tax. As a matter of fact, when a few of the congressmen opposed the income tax, They said, conceivably the income tax can go as high as 10%, which is what the maximum the Bible indicates that could be subject to tax. 10%, of course, was only 1% on amounts from 4,000 to 20,000, and then it was, I think it was 2% from 20,000 to 50. So a man in 1913 who made $20,000 only paid $160. And a man in 1913 who made $20,000 probably had 3 or 4 servants, and $160 was no big concern to him anyway. But the tax was only 1%. Now let's assume the tax was realistic. The income tax should not be higher than 10%, because this is no longer a tax. It's confiscation of a substantial substantial amount of your income. Now, the founding fathers who wrote the Constitution were well aware of the book The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. And Adam Smith describes how taxes were imposed in Europe. For instance, the Dutch had to raise taxes to build all those dikes. And in Switzerland, they also imposed taxes, and they did it. It was called the 50th penny. In other words, the maximum tax, as Adam Smith pointed out, would be 2% on a person's capital. So a person who owned 100, and they would come and they would declare under penalty of perjury the amount of capital they possessed. And it was assumed that since they swore that this was the amount, that alone would compel them to tell the truth. So a person during the time of the founding fathers, this is what they conceived that taxation meant, direct taxation meant. So if a person during the period of time when the Constitution was written, if a person had $100,000 of property, the maximum tax on that would be 2% or $2,000. Now people who have no property at all have to get up $5,000 and $6,000 to pay their income tax. That is not a tax, that's confiscation. That is reducing you to the level of a serf, because the founding fathers knew the difference between being a free person and a serf. And a serf was compelled to turn over to his lord and master 25% approximately of his productivity. What does that make an American who now turns over 40 and 50% to government? State, federal, local, city, between property taxes, sales taxes. Before the war, before the Second World War, the average taxation only took up between 6 to 8% of a person's income. Now, America no longer, this is no longer a land of the free and the home of the brave. It's the land of the indentured and the home of the meek. But the point is this: why can the government seek to extract far more from people than they've earned, which no medieval tyrant would have attempted to do? Very simple. Suppose the income tax was imposed using reasonable limits. 5%, let's say 10%. Okay, so if you didn't pay the tax, if they wanted to impose a penalty of 15%, so it's another 5%. But when the tax rates already are 40 and 50%, and now you add, like in my case, 75%, now you get 60, 70% of what you earn, and then they add interest to that. Well, in no time at all, the government earns more than you earn, forgetting about what it required to just sustain your life of food, clothing, and shelter. Now, this is the kind of government and taxation the American public has allowed the federal government to saddle them with. And of course, the former Chief Justice John Marshall said the power to tax is the power to destroy. And with this illegal tax, the government has actually destroyed America's entire industrial base. Today, the federal government has to go to Asian nations each day to borrow $2 billion so it can pay its bills. That's the nature of the federal government. We have right now an $800 billion trade deficit. If anybody had suggested 20 years ago that this country would have a trade deficit of $800 billion, they would have sent, they would have sent them to a funny farm. Nobody would have believed it. When I wrote the book, my first book, The Biggest Con, I complained about a trade deficit of $30 billion, and now it's $800 billion, and it's been going up $100 billion a year. Now, when I was growing up in the 30s and 40s, even into the 50s, all the products that we use in America were made in America. Our shoes were made here. Our athletic equipment was made here. Our automobiles were made here. Our appliances were made here. As a matter of fact, if somebody wanted to brag that they had money, they were wealthy, they might say, you see this shirt, it's imported. You see these shoes, it's imported. Who wore imported shoes? My shoes came from Tom McCann, $5 and $6. We had all kinds of American companies making clothing, Bond, Robert Hall from Gaspar. Now go try to find a product made in the United States. We're totally dependent on importation, not only of foreign goods, but foreign capital. It's only a question of time before this nation suffers a total economic collapse. We now have a nation of 300 million people who make almost nothing. Oh yeah, in the GP we have a lot of income to lawyers, to accountants, to PR people, to retail people, but how much money is made by people producing real wealth? When the government announces, oh, last month we created 200,000 jobs. Where were those jobs created? Do they bother to tell you? No. In health service, in health care, in retail, in accounting, in business services. And then in the bottom of the article it says, oh, but we lost another 30,000 in manufacturing jobs. The jobs that really count. So now we have a nation that produces almost nothing, where once America was considered the arsenal of democracy, we've flooded the world with mass-produced items. Now, the handwriting is on the wall. You can't even be a military power unless you're an industrial power, and we're no longer an industrial power. You know who the industrial power is today? China. China makes all the goods that we need. If you go into Walmart and took out all the Chinese products, or made in Asia, there'd be nothing on the shelves. Now, can anybody figure out that China is going to be the military power in years to come? Because they are going to have the factories that can produce the tanks and guns and everything else that it takes to be a military power. When America got involved in the Second World War, all our manufacturing companies shifted to making war material. Now, what factories are going to be able to make that shift today? We are living on borrowed time. And the government was able to do this because it had legally collected income tax. And now I'm going to give you proof. Proof! And when I say proof, you know, there's been a lot of criticism of the federal judges today. Well, the criticism has never gone far enough. Practically the entire federal judiciary should be behind bars, and I'm going to give you proof of that. And in the entire tax division of the Justice Department, they also should be behind bars, and I'm going to give you proof of that. So there's not going to be any ifs, buts, or yeah about it. You see this Internal Revenue Code, which I sell, okay? Now, if you take the Internal Revenue Code, you will not find in it any reference to the IRS. The only reference to it is to the Secretary. It says the Secretary can do this, the Secretary can do that. And by referring to the Secretary, it means the Secretary of the Treasury. So all enforcement powers with respect to income tax are given to the Secretary of the Treasury. However, this is a motion I filed, and this motion is on my website. Go to my website and read this motion. It's only 12 pages, and it's indicated, it's the first motion reference to my website. It's only 12 pages. And this 12-page motion will convince you that every federal judge and every U.S. attorney should be behind bars. Why? Because in that motion I explain, since I am and two others are being criminally prosecuted 2 weeks from today for on a variety of income tax charges, including the government has charged me and Cindy Noon and Larry Cohn with a conspiracy to interfere with the IRS's ability to assess, collect, etc. However, the IRS is not even mentioned in the Internal Revenue Code, so how can I, Cindy and Larry, be involved in a conspiracy to prevent the IRS from doing what the law doesn't even allow them to do? Now, how can you prove this? Well, since there is absolutely no mention of the there is a mention of the IRS. See, here's the Internal Revenue Code, and that portion of the code that deals with income taxes probably is 2/3 from here to here. Now, in the back, way in here, there's a mention of the Internal Revenue Service in connection with some nebulous committee to help them to do something. But the mention of the IRS has nothing to do with the enforcement of the income tax. Suffice it to say, there's absolutely no mention of the IRS in that portion of the code that deals with income tax. But in any case, there is a law, and here's the statute. The statute is 26 U.S.
Irwin Schiff, from our 2005 interview with him in his office in Las Vegas, which I like to call Lost Wages. Irwin Schiff was one fantastic human being. Started out, I think, a marriage, grew up a family in Beverly Hills, went to prison for not filing taxes. While he was in prison, he actually read the entire code, studied the tax, came out with a book called The Federal Mafia. He also came out with numerous other little books. And if you look him up on Wikipedia, it'll say he claims he had a theory. Well, a lot of people have followed his theory, probably in the numbers of about 2 million people, and simply stopped paying or only paid a fraction of what the 1040 form wants them to pay. This was the unspecified crime that Irwin Schiff allegedly did. And I'm just asking you, President Trump, you know, Congressman Carbajal and Senator Harris, why not just abolish the national debt like Iceland did, and all that debt's going, we don't have to pay taxes, then whatever taxes we do pay, federal excise taxes, goes to pay the current federal budget, which needs to be slashed massively. I'm so glad, I'm so proud of our President Trump shutting down the federal government. Anyway, that's our show tonight. Thank you. I'm saying goodnight and play a little music. Remember the Icelandic Revolution. Research it. We could have a better one here. Thanks for watching Take Back America. I'm William Wagener. This January of 2019.
You're smiling. Keep on smiling.
Thanks for watching. I'm William Wagener, hoping I got you to have some second thoughts about our presidents in the past and how it affects today. And that picture of that black woman with the shotgun, notice all the people demanding for gun control. You hardly ever see any black people demanding gun control. The KKK was running around. The first gun control laws were meant to take guns away from black people who were simply asserting the right not to be burned out of their home by the KKK. Isn't that interesting? I think it's interesting. So when people talk about gun control, think about the Armenian massacre in 1914. They took the guns away, then they killed them. Same thing with the Jews. Turn in your guns, then they massacred the Jews in Germany in the 1930s to 40s. Gun control is a bad idea. Responsibility is a good idea. See ya.